Imagine for a moment that you are a taxpayer in Minnesota. Every month, you see a portion of your hard-earned paycheck disappear into federal and state coffers. You are told this money is a social contract, it's for infrastructure, for safety, and importantly, to ensure that the most vulnerable children in your community don't go hungry during a global pandemic. Then you wake up to a headline: $100 million of that lunch money is gone. Not lost to bureaucracy, but allegedly siphoned off into private pockets, luxury cars, and real estate. Your blood would boil. It should. This is a five-alarm fire for the rule of law. But here is the question that most of the media, on both sides, refuses to ask. Does your outrage remain just as intense when the number jumps from 100 million to 1.3 billion? And does that outrage evaporate if the person responsible for letting the fraudster walk free is the same person you plan to vote for? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Daniel Kershaw. I am an independent legal and political journalist. I don't work for a network, I don't have a seat on a campaign bus, and I don't take orders from any political party. My job is to sit in the quiet rooms, read the unsealed indictments, parse the court filings, and compare the timeline of events to the rhetoric we hear on our television screens. Today we are going to look past the shouting matches you see on cable news and examine a phenomenon I call the selective blind spot. In this analysis, we are going to deconstruct the recent viral debate on Fox News regarding the Feeding Our Future scandal in Minnesota. We will look at why independent reporting and mainstream journalism converged on this story, but more importantly, we will dive into the legal records that the cameras usually cut away from. The billion-dollar commutations, the Trump University settlements, and the quiet redactions in the Epstein files. By the end of this video, you will understand how law and order is often used as a branding exercise rather than a legal principle. If you're a taxpayer, a homeowner, or someone who simply wants the system to play fair for the little guy, this analysis is for you. We are going to look at the facts that don't fit into a 30-second soundbite. So let's start with the question that started it all. Is anyone actually under the law anymore? Let's look at the evidence. The catalyst for this entire discussion is a program in Minnesota called Feeding Our Future. For those of you who haven't been following the local filings, here is the context. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government relaxed rules for food distribution programs to ensure children stayed fed while schools were closed. This was an emergency measure. However, according to unsealed indictments from the Department of Justice, a group of individuals saw this emergency as an opportunity. The allegation is that they claimed to be feeding tens of thousands of children every day, numbers that in some cases exceeded the entire population of the towns where the sites were supposedly located. They allegedly submitted fake invoices and rosters of names. We are talking about over 250 million in total fraud across various entities, with at least 100 million linked to the primary actors in this specific investigation. Now, a YouTuber named Nick Shirley recently brought this back into the spotlight by physically visiting these sites. He showed empty buildings and misspelled signs, one famously misspelling the word learning. His videos went viral because they provided a visceral, visual confirmation of what investigators had been saying for months. There is a narrative on social media that the liberal media ignored this because it involved minority communities and blue state mismanagement. But when you actually look at the timeline, that narrative falls apart. One of the most exhaustive investigative deep dives into this fraud was published by the New York Times. They were the ones who uncovered internal emails showing that when the Minnesota Department of Education tried to stop payments to Feeding Our Future due to a lack of documentation, the organization's leadership threatened to sue for racial discrimination. This is a critical point from a legal perspective. It shows how legitimate social concerns like racial equity can be weaponized as a legal shield to prevent financial oversight. For any journalist or lawyer, this is a massive red flag. It's a subversion of the system. This brings us to the recent segment on Fox News. The hosts were quite rightfully incensed. They spoke with a sense of righteous fury about the collapse of civilization. They highlighted the Somali community's involvement in the Minnesota case and argued that this was a uniquely liberal problem, a symptom of a weak DOJ and a corrupt Democratic establishment. But then the dynamic changed. Jessica Tarlov, the lone dissenting voice on the panel, was given the floor. She didn't defend the Minnesota fraudsters. In fact, she called the behavior disgusting. But she did something that cable news hosts rarely do. She provided a comparative legal record. She pointed out that while the panel was screaming about a $100 million Minnesota, they were remarkably silent about the billions in fraud involving associates of Donald Trump. The reaction from the rest of the panel was telling. It wasn't a rebuttal, it was an instant shift in energy. They didn't want to talk about the hood of their own car. As a legal analyst, I found this moment fascinating because it highlights the partisan filter. In the partisan filter, fraud is only a crime when committed by the other side. When it's committed by your side, it's a witch hunt, a civil matter, or a misunderstanding. Let's look at the first item Tarlov mentioned, Trump University. To be clear, this was a civil case, not a criminal one, but the details are important for understanding the anti-corruption brand. For years, Trump University promised to teach everyday Americans the secrets of real estate success. However, according to the lawsuits filed by the New York Attorney General and former students, the university was essentially a high-pressure sales funnel. It wasn't an accredited school, and the hand-picked instructors were often anything but. In 2016, just before taking office, Donald Trump agreed to a $25 million settlement to resolve 3 separate lawsuits. Now, a settlement is not a legal admission of guilt, but you don't pay $25 million if there isn't significant evidence that could lead to a far more expensive judgment. The court records showed that vulnerable people, retirees, veterans, and middle-class workers had spent tens of thousands of dollars on gold programs that provided little to no value. If we are outraged by scammers taking $100 million in COVID relief, we must, by the same legal logic, be concerned when a high-level political figure pays millions to settle claims of systemic consumer fraud. Why? Because both cases involve the exploitation of trust. This brings us to the most troubling part of the legal record, the use of executive clemency to override the work of the Department of Justice. One name that Jessica Tarlov brought up, which should make every taxpayer's skin crawl, is Philip Esform. If you haven't read the DOJ press release on this, you should. Philip Esform was a nursing home mogul in Florida. In 2019, he was convicted for his role in what the DOJ described as the largest healthcare fraud scheme ever charged by the Department of Justice. We are talking about $1.3 billion in fraudulent claims to Medicare and Medicaid. Esform was convicted of money laundering, receiving kickbacks, and bribing a state regulator. This wasn't a paperwork error. This was a systemic, decade-long plundering of the system meant to care for the elderly and the poor. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. In December 2020, Donald Trump commuted Esform's sentence. A man who stole over $1 billion from the taxpayers was allowed to walk free after serving only a fraction of his time. Then there is David Gentile. He was the founder of GPB Capital, a private equity firm. According to the SEC and federal prosecutors, Gentile and his associates operated a Ponzi-like scheme that defrauded more than 17,000 investors out of $1.6 billion. They allegedly used new investor money to pay out dividends to older investors while siphoning off millions for personal luxuries. Gentile also received executive clemency. Think about the scale of this for a moment. The Minnesota daycare fraud that has everyone so angry. It's $100 million. Philip Esform and David Gentile combined represent nearly $3 billion in alleged and proven fraud. From a legal perspective, this is where the law and order brand falls apart. If you claim to be the anti-corruption candidate, but you use your unique constitutional power to release the perpetrators of the largest financial frauds in history, you are not fighting the swamp. You are effectively becoming its patron. This brings us to the final piece of this puzzle, the Epstein files. Recently, over 1 million pages of documents related to Jeffrey Epstein's associates were released, or rather, discovered. We have been told for years that the investigation into Epstein was exhaustive, yet somehow 1 million pages of documents just appeared. As a journalist, this triggers every alarm bell I have. This speaks to a failure of institutional transparency. But look at the redactions. When you read through the publicly available filings, you see a consistent pattern. While the names of victims should, by law, be redacted to protect their privacy, we are seeing redactions of names that appear to be co-conspirators. There are reports that photographs of powerful figures, including Donald Trump, have been appearing and then disappearing from various tranches of evidence. The White House and the DOJ, under both the current and previous administrations, have been accused of covering up the full scope of Epstein's network. When a court rules that documents must be public, but the government spends months or years hiding names, it tells the American public that there is a different set of rules for the powerful. Whether it's the Biden administration's DOJ or the Trump administration's pardons, the common thread is the protection of the club. If you're a survivor of Epstein's abuse, or if you're a taxpayer watching billion-dollar fraudsters walk free, the message is the same: your justice is secondary to their protection. I want to talk directly to those of you who are watching this and thinking, Daniel, why does this matter to me? I'm just trying to pay my mortgage and get through the week. It matters because every dollar stolen in a healthcare fraud scheme is a dollar that increases your insurance premiums. Every dollar siphoned off in a COVID relief scam is a dollar that contributes to the inflation that makes your groceries more expensive. But more than the money, it's about the rule of law. The rule of law is the only thing that protects a person with no money from a person with all the money. It is the agreement that the same rules apply to the billionaire in the penthouse as they do to the worker in the factory. When we see law and order being used as a partisan weapon, where we scream about 100 million because it fits a narrative, but ignore 3 billion because it doesn't, we are witnessing the death of that principle. If you only care about fraud when it's committed by your political enemies, you don't actually care about fraud, you care about power. The reason Jessica Tarlov's exchange went viral wasn't because people love cable news arguments, it was because she pierced the vignette. She spoke a truth that is uncomfortable for both sides of the aisle. Our outrage has become a commodity. If you are a Fox viewer, you were shown a terrifying story about Somali immigrants stealing your money. That is a factually grounded story that deserves your anger. But you were not shown the story of the healthcare executive who stole 10 times more and was set free by the man the network supports. If you are a liberal viewer, you might be cheering for Tarlov, but you must also ask why the DNC and the current DOJ are so slow to release an autopsy of their own failures, or why they are so protective of the redactions in the Epstein files. Corruption isn't a red problem or a blue problem. It is an institutional problem. It thrives in the shadows of partisan loyalty. It grows when we are so busy yelling at each other about 100 million that we don't notice the $3 billion walking out the back door. As we wrap up this analysis, I want to go back to that big idea we started with. Is anyone still under the law? Right now, the answer feels like it depends. It depends on who you know, which party you belong to, and how much money you have in the bank. This is a dangerous place for a republic to be. When a former president frames himself as an anti-corruption crusader while commuting the sentences of the nation's most prolific fraudsters, it creates a massive credibility gap. When a current administration promises transparency but delivers 1 million pages of late Epstein documents, it creates a trust gap. For the people of Minnesota, the Feeding Our Future case is a tragedy. It's money that should have gone to kids. For the 17,000 investors in David Gentile's scheme, their life savings are gone. For the taxpayers who paid into Medicare for decades, Philip S. Form's fraud is a slap in the face. The common denominator in all of these cases is a total disregard for the public good, and the common denominator in the political reaction is a total disregard for consistency. I've spent years looking at court documents and following the paper trail of American power. If there is one thing I've learned, it's that the truth is usually buried in the stuff that makes people uncomfortable. If you're exhausted by the shouting and the spin, I don't blame you. Most people don't have the time to read through $1.3 billion healthcare indictments or compare the redactions in the Epstein files. That's why these details matter. That's why we have to look under the hood. So I want to leave you with a question, and I want you to be honest with yourself, regardless of your politics. Where is the line for you? At what point does a political figure's law and order rhetoric become so detached from their actual record of clemency and settlements that you can no longer support them? If a decision by a court or a president can directly impact the safety of your tax dollars and the integrity of your legal system, at what point do you stop viewing it as politics and start viewing it as a threat to your way of life? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you think we've reached a point where justice is truly a partisan commodity? Or do you still believe that the system can be held accountable if we stop looking through a partisan lens? Let's have a real civil conversation in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the legal records and institutional consistency valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm Daniel Kershaw, an independent legal and political journalist. My goal is to provide you with the context and the facts that the headlines miss. If you want to understand how these court rulings and executive decisions are touching your wallet and your freedom, hit the notification bell. We will continue to follow the paper trail no matter where it leads. Thank you for your time. Thank you for caring about the rule of law. I'll see you in the next analysis.